The water is a privilege, not a right, Mr. Coleman, and your privileges have just been revoked. Karen stood on my lawn, a self-satisfied smirk plastered across her face, her plus-size frame squeezed into a beige pantsuit that screamed suburban authority. Beside her, a man in greasy coveralls was turning a long T-handle wrench on the main water valve near my driveway, the squeal of protesting metal echoing in the crisp morning air. My prize-winning roses, the ones my late wife Sarah had planted, seemed to wilt in protest. A small laminated tag bearing the logo of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association now dangled from the shutoff valve, a tiny flag planted by a conquering tyrant. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my gut, the kind of feeling I hadn't had since my last tour in Iraq, the kind that precedes chaos. She had finally done it. After months of petty notices about the height of my grass and the color of my mailbox, she had escalated to cutting off the lifeblood of my home. The financial loss was immediate. My automated irrigation system for the small orchard I cultivated was now useless, and the summer heat was unforgiving. But it was the sheer audacity, the raw, unearned arrogance of this woman, a retired DMV manager turned neighborhood despot, that truly set my teeth on edge. She was trespassing on my property, destroying my livelihood, and declaring it a victory. She had no idea the war she had just declared, and she had absolutely no concept of the ground upon which she stood. She thought she was turning off a spigot. She had just handed me the keys to her kingdom. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA president who thinks they're the queen of a half-acre fiefdom, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because you're going to want to see how this ends. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Or better yet, share your own HOA nightmare. Now let me tell you how we got here. This land, this specific 10-acre plot, wasn't just a house to me. It was a legacy. My grandfather, a man with hands like leather and a will of iron, bought this tract back in the 40s when it was nothing but rolling hills and oak trees. He built the original farmhouse with his own two hands and, most importantly, he drilled the well. He chased that water table down 200 feet through solid rock and clay, and when he finally hit the aquifer, the water that came up was cold, clear, and endless. That well, housed in a small, sturdy brick pump house he also built, became the heart of this land. When I retired from the Army Corps of Engineers after 25 years of service, this was the only place I wanted to be. I built my new home on the foundation of the old one, and I spent the first year of my retirement restoring my grandfather's work, including upgrading the well pump and the filtration system. For a decade, I lived in peace. Then came Oakwood Estates. A developer bought the surrounding 100 acres, and soon the cookie-cutter McMansions started sprouting like mushrooms after a rainstorm. I didn't mind. I kept to myself. My property was explicitly excluded from the new development's plat, a fact I had triple-checked myself. When the HOA was formed, I received a polite letter inviting me to join. I politely declined. A few years later, a second letter arrived, this one less polite, informing me that I was being assessed a road maintenance fee since my driveway connected to their new, pristine asphalt cul-de-sac. I consulted a lawyer who told me they might have a leg to stand on, so I paid the modest annual fee without protest. It was easier than a fight. That was my mistake. That was the crack in the door that Karen, elected HOA president on a platform of restoring community values, eventually kicked wide open. The road fee slowly, insidiously morphed into a full HOA membership assessment. Suddenly, I was getting notices. My fence, the same rustic split-rail fence that had marked my property line for half a century, was not in compliance with Section 8, subsection B of the community bylaws. My small vegetable garden was an unapproved agricultural enterprise, and now this. She'd found a clause about the HOA controlling all utility access points within the community and had decided my water main, which she wrongly assumed was a feed from the city, fell under her jurisdiction. She stood there basking in the glow of her perceived power while the contractor finished his work and packed up his tools. The board will review your status once all outstanding fines are paid and all violations are remediated, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Until then, I'd suggest you get used to bottled water. She turned and waddled back toward her identical house across the street, leaving me in the unnerving silence of a home without running water. I looked at the limp tag on the valve, then at the sturdy little brick pump house 50 yards away, chugging along silently, doing its job. A slow, grim smile spread across my face. She hadn't just cut me off. She'd cut her entire neighborhood off from the only source of water they had. And she had just given me, the man who owned the well, the pump, the pipes, and the land they were all buried under, the perfect reason to finally draw a new map of her little kingdom. The silence in the house was the first thing that hit me. Not the usual quiet of a peaceful morning, but a dead, hollow silence. The hum of the refrigerator was there, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, but the subtle, almost subconscious gurgle of water resting in the pipes was gone. It felt like the house was holding its breath. I walked into the kitchen and turned the faucet. A pathetic cough, a spurt of brown-tinged water, and then nothing but a dry hiss. My first instinct, drilled into me over decades of military service, was to remain calm and assess the situation. Panic is a luxury you can't afford when things go sideways. I walked back outside, the morning sun now climbing higher, casting long shadows across the lawn. I knelt by the valve. The contractor had done a thorough job. It was cranked down tight. The plastic HOA tag felt flimsy and insulting in my hand. I could have taken a wrench to it right then and there, restored my own water, and dealt with the fallout later. But that would have been a tactical error. It would have made me the aggressor in her narrative. Vandalism, she'd call it. Destruction of HOA property. No, this required a different approach. This wasn't a skirmish, it was a campaign, and campaigns are won with logistics and intelligence, not brute force. I went back inside, not to the kitchen, but to my study. It was my sanctuary, a room paneled in dark cherry wood, filled with books on engineering, history, and geology. On the wall hung framed maps of places I'd been, canal projects in Panama, dam constructions in Africa, airfield layouts in Afghanistan. My whole life had been about understanding the ground beneath my feet and the systems that make civilization possible. And Karen, in her breathtaking ignorance, had just challenged me on my home turf. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my large oak desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. The embossed letters on the front were faded but clear. Coleman Property, established 1946. Inside, protected by archival plastic sleeves, was every document pertaining to my 10 acres. The original deed, signed in my grandfather's elegant, looping script. The survey maps from 1946, 1978, and the most recent one from 2005 when I built the new house. And tucked in a heavy vellum envelope were the water rights certificates and the original well drilling logs from the State Geological Survey. I spread them out across the polished surface of my desk. The documents felt cool and heavy, anchors to a reality that predated Karen and her three-ring binder of suburban tyranny. The plat map was unequivocal. It showed my 10-acre parcel as a perfect rectangle with the surrounding land, now Oakwood Estates, clearly designated as a separate entity. The well and the pump house were located a good 100 feet inside my property line. I then traced the lines I had my father help me map years ago, the underground pipes leading from the well. One main line went directly to my house, but another, a much larger 4-inch main, branched off and ran straight to the edge of my property, where it connected to the infrastructure of the burgeoning subdivision. I remembered the conversation with the developer, a slick but ultimately reasonable man named Henderson. He'd offered to pay to connect his new development to the municipal water main 5 miles away, a project that would have cost him a fortune in easements and construction. Or, he'd proposed, he could pay me a handsome fee to tap into my grandfather's prodigious well. My well had been tested and rated for a flow rate that could easily support 100 homes. We'd made a gentleman's agreement, sealed with a handshake, and a simple one-page contract that granted his development utility access in exchange for him covering all the maintenance costs of the pump and filtration system, plus a modest annual stipend. Henderson had sold out years ago, and the HOA had inherited the arrangement. They'd been paying the maintenance company and sending me a check every year like clockwork, but it was clear they had no idea what the payment was actually for. They thought it was for an easement, a right-of-way. They had no earthly idea they weren't just passing a pipe through my land. They were drinking my water from my well. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Karen, in her quest to control my life, had ceremoniously cut me off from my own water supply. But in doing so, she had also cut off herself and the other 53 homes in Oakwood Estates. It wouldn't be immediate. The system had a large pressure tank and thousands of feet of pipe holding a reserve. But within 24 to 48 hours, faucets would begin to sputter, showers would turn to trickles, and toilets would cease to refill. Her kingdom would run dry. My next move was critical. I needed to fortify my position with indisputable third-party verification. I carefully packed the portfolio, slid it into my briefcase, and grabbed my keys. The county records office was a 30-minute drive away, a drab brick building that smelled of old paper and dust. But to me, it was an armory. I was going to collect my ammunition. As I drove, I felt a grim sense of purpose settle over me. This was no longer about a fence or a vegetable garden. This was about property rights, about legacy, and about putting a bully in her place. Karen had mistaken my quiet, reserved nature for weakness. She had mistaken my desire for a peaceful retirement for apathy. As an engineer, I knew that the most powerful force in the universe isn't explosive. It's pressure, applied steadily and precisely until the thing you are pushing against either moves or breaks. And I was about to start applying pressure. The county records office was exactly as I remembered it. A hushed, fluorescent-lit cavern of rolling metal shelves and weary-looking clerks. The air was thick with the scent of decaying paper, a smell I found strangely comforting. It was the smell of facts, of history etched in ink. I approached the main counter, where a woman with a formidable beehive hairdo and glasses perched on the end of her nose looked up at me over a dog-eared romance novel. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she'd rather I say no. I gave her my most disarming smile, the one I used to use on stubborn local officials in foreign countries. "Yes, ma'am. I'd like to get certified copies of the original plat map for the Oakwood Estates subdivision, as well as the full property deed and any recorded easements for parcel number 7B412. I knew my parcel number by heart. She sighed, a long, mournful sound, and slowly swiveled in her chair to face a computer terminal that looked older than my last car. After a few minutes of clacking keys, she grunted. "Coleman, John, 10 acres. She looked at me with a flicker of interest. "That's the old Henderson farm plot, isn't it? The one that never sold to the developer?" "The very same," I confirmed. "My grandfather's place." This small piece of information seemed to grease the wheels of bureaucracy. She became noticeably more helpful, guiding me through the process of requesting the documents. An hour and $47 later, I walked out with a thick envelope containing freshly stamped, legally binding certified copies of everything I had in my portfolio, plus a few extras, the original articles of incorporation for the Oakwood Estates HOA, and a complete record of all their filed bylaws. It was all public record, a treasure trove for anyone who knew where to look. My next stop was downtown, at the law office of Martinez and Associates. Maria Martinez was a retired JAG Corps lawyer I'd served with briefly at Fort Bragg. She was sharp, aggressive, and had a deep-seated intolerance for bullies. Her office was modern and minimalist, a stark contrast to the county building, but it had the same air of serious purpose. I found her standing over a light table, examining a complex zoning map. She looked up as I entered, her expression stern until she recognized me. "Jack, what brings you into the belly of the beast?" she said, breaking into a warm smile. "I'd hoped you were enjoying your retirement too much to need my services." "I was," I said, shaking her hand, "but it seems the beast has come to my doorstep." I didn't waste time with small talk. I laid the certified documents out on her large conference table, arranging them in chronological order. I placed my own leather portfolio beside them for comparison. "Let's start at the beginning," I said. For the next hour, I walked her through the history of the land, the well, the gentleman's agreement with the developer, and the slow creep of the HOA's influence. I finished with the events of that morning, describing Karen's smug pronouncement and the little laminated tag now hanging on my water valve. Maria listened intently, her eyes scanning the documents as I spoke. She picked up the certified plat map, then the water rights certificate. A slow, dangerous smile, the kind I'd seen her flash just before she eviscerated a witness on the stand, spread across her face. "Oh, she did not," Maria whispered, almost to herself. "Jack, this is beautiful. This is a work of art." "I thought you might appreciate the legal topography," I said. "Appreciate it? I want to frame it," she replied, her energy level rising. "This isn't just an overreach, Jack. This is illegal entry, trespassing, willful destruction of private property, and tortious interference with a utility. She used an unlicensed contractor to tamper with a private water system that serves an entire community. The liability here is staggering. She's opened up the HOA and herself personally to a lawsuit that would make their eyes water if they had any water left to cry with." She paced the room for a moment, energized. "Okay, we don't go in with guns blazing. Not yet. We play your game. We use procedure. We use documentation. We build a cage of paper and law so tight that by the time she realizes she's in it, it's too late." She sat down. "All business now. First, we send a demand letter. Not a friendly request, a formal legal demand. We cite the specific statutes she's violated. We demand immediate restoration of service to your residents by a licensed and bonded plumber at their expense. We demand removal of all HOA-related materials from your private property, and we attach copies of the deed and the plat map. We give them 24 hours to comply." "She'll ignore it," I predicted. "She'll see it as a threat and try to rally the board against me." "Exactly," Maria said, her smile returning. "And that's step 2. Her predictable arrogance is our greatest asset. When she ignores the demand, she's willfully ignoring a legal notice of her trespass. That elevates everything. It demonstrates intent. While she's puffing out her chest, you're going to be talking to your neighbors." I raised an eyebrow. "And what do I tell them?" "Nothing about the well. Not yet. That's our ace in the hole. You're just a concerned fellow homeowner. You're going to conduct quiet, sympathetic interviews. You're going to find out who else Karen has bullied. You're going to document every petty fine, every threat, every abuse of power. You're building a pattern of behavior file. When the time comes, we won't just be fighting for your water. We'll be liberating a captive community, and they will be standing right behind you." The plan was elegant, precise, and methodical. It appealed to the engineer in me. We would draft the letter immediately. It would be sent via courier, requiring a signature upon receipt. The clock would start the moment Karen signed for it. Leaving Maria's office, I felt a sense of cold, calculated clarity. The initial anger had subsided, replaced by a steely resolve. This woman had tried to humiliate me and strip me of a basic necessity. She thought she was making a show of power, but all she had done was awaken a part of me that had been dormant for a long time. The part that systematically dismantles problems, piece by piece, until nothing is left but the solution. The courier delivered the legal envelope to Karen's doorstep at precisely 9:17 the next morning. I watched from my study window as she opened the door in a fluffy pink bathrobe, her face a mask of confusion that quickly curdled into outrage as she read the first page. She looked across the street directly at my house, her eyes narrowed to slits. I didn't move from the window. I wanted her to see me. I gave a slow, deliberate nod, then drew the blinds. Let her stew. Let her ego and her ignorance collide. As Maria predicted, the 24-hour deadline came and went with contemptuous silence. No phone call, no email. The water remained off. The only response was a new piece of paper taped to my front door on the second morning. It was an official HOA notice, printed on heavy cardstock, announcing a series of new, breathtakingly punitive fines. I was being fined $500 for failure to maintain a green lawn, a direct consequence of her cutting off my sprinklers. Another $500 for improper legal correspondence, apparently for daring to have a lawyer contact them. And the pièce de résistance, a $1,000 fine for unauthorized modification of a community utility access point, citing the now absent contractor's work as something I had solicited. It was so absurd, so brazenly hypocritical, it was almost comical. She wasn't just ignoring the law, she was inventing her own to counter it. This was her doubling down, her attempt to bury me in paper and debt, the classic strategy of a bureaucratic bully. I carefully peeled the notice from my door, photographed it next to a copy of that day's newspaper to establish the date, and slid it into a growing file folder labeled Karen. Then I began phase 2 of my operation, Reconnaissance. I started with my next-door neighbor, George Peterson. George was a retired accountant in his late 70s, a quiet man who spent most of his days tending his immaculate rose garden, a passion he'd shared with my late wife. I found him methodically deadheading his blossoms, his movements precise and practiced. "Morning, George," I said, leaning on the fence that separated our properties, the very non-compliant fence I'd been fined for. "Jack," he nodded, not looking up from a particularly stubborn weed. "Heard you're having some trouble with the queen bee." News traveled fast in a suburban cul-de-sac. "You could say that," I said. "She's decided I don't deserve to have running water." George finally stopped and looked at me, his expression grim. "That woman is a menace. Last month, she fined me $200 because my wind chimes were exceeding acceptable decibel levels. I've had those chimes for 20 years. My wife, Eleanor, loved them." He sighed. "I just paid it. It's not worth the fight." "That's what she counts on, George," I said gently. "She isolates us, makes us think we're the only ones, that it's easier to just pay up and shut up." I spent 20 minutes listening to George detail a litany of petty harassments, taking mental notes of each one. The wind chimes, the unapproved garden gnome, the demand that he paint his front door a more harmonious shade of beige. Next, I visited the Garcia family, who lived 2 doors down. They were a young couple with 2 small children. I found Marco Garcia in his driveway, staring glumly at a patch of bare ground in his backyard where a swing set used to be. "Mr. Coleman," he said, shaking my hand. "Anything I can do for you?" "I'm just talking to folks, Marco, seeing how everyone's getting along with the HOA." His face darkened. "You mean Karen? She made us take down our kid's swing set, said the primary colors were visually disruptive, forced us to submit a new design for a natural wood tone play structure for approval. The kids have been heartbroken." His wife Elena came out, holding a toddler on her hip. "She told me the smell of our barbecue was offensive during her garden party," she added, her voice tight with anger. "She's a tyrant." It was the same story at every house. The Millers were fined because their basketball hoop was left out overnight. The Chen family was ordered to remove a small stone lantern from their flower bed because it was deemed culturally inappropriate for the neighborhood's aesthetic. Karen had woven a web of fear and intimidation, fining and threatening her neighbors into silent compliance. Each person I spoke to was angry, but they all felt powerless, isolated. None of them knew that their neighbors were suffering the same indignities. I didn't mention my own plan. I didn't talk about the well or the lawsuit. My purpose was to listen, to gather intelligence, and to plant a seed. The seed was a simple question I asked at the end of each conversation. What if we all compared notes? What if we discovered we weren't alone? By the end of the day, I had a detailed dossier on Karen's reign of terror. She had levied over $10,000 in frivolous fines in the last year alone. She had threatened liens on 3 properties. She had used the HOA's Architectural Review Committee, which she chaired, as a personal weapon to enforce her own bland, beige taste on the entire community. Meanwhile, the pressure in the neighborhood's water pipes was beginning to drop. I noticed it first in the late afternoon when I saw George's sprinklers, which ran on a timer, sputtering weakly instead of their usual robust spray. Later that evening, I saw Karen herself standing on her porch, glaring at her own drooping petunias. The delicious irony was not lost on me. In her attempt to create a water shortage for me, she had only managed to create one for herself. She was so blinded by her personal vendetta that she couldn't see the larger logistical reality. She was the captain of a ship who, in an attempt to keel-haul a single sailor, had ordered the crew to drill a hole in the hull. The ship was taking on water, and the captain was blaming the sailor. The stage was being set for a confrontation, but it wouldn't be the one she was expecting. She thought she was fighting a war of attrition against a stubborn old man. She had no idea she was about to face a unified, armed, and informed citizenry. And I, the quiet engineer, was about to hand them their weapons. With my dossier on Karen's abuses complete and the demand letter officially ignored, it was time for Maria and me to construct the cage. We met in her office. The documents I'd gathered spread across the table like a battle plan. Maria read through my notes on the neighbors' grievances, a grim look on her face. It's a classic pattern, she said, tapping a pen on the stack of complaints. She uses the broad, vague language in the bylaws to justify a personal vendetta. Visually disruptive, harmonious shades. That's all subjective nonsense, and it's designed to be. It gives the person in charge absolute power, but that's also her weakness. A judge will see this for what it is, a systematic abuse of authority. So, we sue her and the HOA, I said. Not yet, Maria countered, holding up a hand. A lawsuit is our nuclear option. Right now, we're still in the conventional warfare stage. We need to create a situation where she destroys herself. We're going to draft the single most comprehensive, ironclad, and legally terrifying document she has ever seen. For the next several hours, we worked on what we began to call the Water Utility Easement and Service Agreement. It wasn't just a contract. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering. We started with the foundational truths, laying them out in incontrovertible whereas clauses. Whereas the property of John Coleman predates the establishment of the Oakwood Estates subdivision. Whereas the sole source of potable water for the Oakwood Estates subdivision is the private well located on the aforementioned Coleman property. Whereas the Oakwood Estates HOA has been utilizing this private water source based on a non-transferable informal agreement with a previous developer. Whereas the HOA, through its president Karen Miller, has illegally tampered with this private utility, terminating service to the legal owner of the well and jeopardizing the water supply for the entire community. The opening paragraphs alone were enough to induce a panic attack in any competent lawyer. But the real genius was in the terms of the agreement itself. We weren't just proposing to turn the water back on, we were proposing a complete restructuring of the neighborhood's water governance. The agreement stipulated the formation of a Oakwood Water Board, a new nonprofit entity to be run by 3 elected homeowners. The board's sole purpose would be to manage the water system, collect fees for maintenance and electricity, and act as the official liaison with me, the utility owner. Crucially, we added a clause explicitly stating that the current HOA president or any member of the HOA's executive board was ineligible to serve on the water board. This was designed to surgically remove Karen from any position of power over the water supply. The agreement set a fair and transparent water fee for each household, calculated based on the actual costs of electricity, routine maintenance, and a small annual licensing fee for me, which was actually less than the easement fee they'd been paying before. But then came the teeth. The final section, titled Covenants and Penalties, was Maria's masterstroke. It stated that any attempt by any party, including the HOA, to restrict, tamper with, or otherwise interfere with the well, the pump house, or any part of the water distribution system located on my property would result in an immediate and automatic termination of the entire agreement. If that clause were ever triggered, I would be legally obligated to disconnect the neighborhood from my well permanently. The liability for rendering over 50 homes without water would fall squarely on the shoulders of the entity that caused the breach, in this case, the HOA. They would be sued into oblivion by every single homeowner. This, Maria said, tapping the final page with satisfaction, is not a negotiation. It's a surrender document. They will sign it, or you will cap your well, connect to the city main at their expense as per state utility laws, and leave them to figure out how to explain to 53 families that their homes are now worthless because they have no water source. As we finalized the document, my phone buzzed. It was a text from George. Pressure is way down. My wife's petunias are dying. Karen sent out an email blaming a blockage in the municipal feed and is calling for an emergency assessment to pay for major repairs. People are getting nervous. I showed the text to Maria. She laughed, a sharp barking sound. It's perfect. She's fabricating a crisis that she herself created, and she's trying to profit from it. We let her. Let her whip them into a frenzy. Let her stand up in front of the whole neighborhood and demand more money to fix a problem of her own making. It will make the reveal that much sweeter. We made dozens of copies of the full agreement, complete with copies of the plat maps and my water rights certificates. I took the stack home, feeling the weight of them in my briefcase. It felt like the weight of justice. That evening, the official notice for the emergency HOA meeting was taped to my door. It was scheduled for 2 days later at the community clubhouse. The agenda was simple: Discussion and vote on a special assessment for urgent water infrastructure repairs. Karen was walking right into the trap. She was building the stage, sending out the invitations, and preparing the spotlight for her own public immolation. I settled into my study, the house still eerily silent without the sound of running water. I used bottled water to make a cup of coffee, the process feeling primitive and strange. The inconvenience was a constant reminder of what was at stake. For 2 more days I would wait. I would watch the neighborhood's lawns turn from green to yellow. I would watch the growing anxiety among my neighbors, and I would prepare for the moment when I would stand up and turn the entire power structure of our community on its head with nothing but a stack of paper and the undeniable truth. The day of the emergency meeting arrived with a suffocating late summer humidity. The neighborhood itself seemed to reflect the growing tension. Lawns were tinged with brown, vibrant flower beds drooped in defeat, and the usual cheerful sounds of kids playing and neighbors chatting had been replaced by a low-grade, anxious murmur. The water pressure had dropped to a pathetic trickle. Showers were impossible, and flushing a toilet had become a strategic decision. Karen, in her communiques, continued to blame the failing municipal infrastructure, a complete fabrication, and framed the upcoming meeting as a moment for the community to come together and invest in our shared future. Her email was a masterclass in corporate doublespeak, designed to create panic and railroad her special assessment through. The meeting was set for 7 p.m. At 6:30, I put on a freshly pressed blue blazer, a simple button-down shirt, and a tie. Maria had advised me to look professional, calm, and utterly in control. I was not to appear as a victim, but as a problem solver. I tucked my thick binder containing the water service agreement and all its supporting evidence under my arm and walked over to the community clubhouse. The room was already packed, the air thick with frustration and the scent of cheap coffee. I saw George sitting near the back, looking grim. The Garcias were there, their faces etched with worry. I saw all the people I had spoken to, a sea of anxious homeowners ready to be fleeced. I took a seat in the front row, directly in Karen's line of sight. When she saw me, her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise before settling back into her usual mask of smug superiority. She clearly expected me to be at home, stewing in my waterless misery. My presence here was an anomaly she couldn't immediately process. Maria arrived a few minutes later, looking sharp and formidable in a dark pantsuit, and took the seat beside me. Her presence caused a ripple of whispers to go through the room. The arrival of a lawyer at an HOA meeting was like a shark being spotted at a public swimming pool. Karen, flanked by the 2 other board members, a meek-looking man named Bob and a woman who looked permanently startled, pounded a gavel on the podium. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice radiating false warmth. "I know we're all concerned about the recent water issues, and I want to assure you, your board has been working tirelessly to address this crisis." She launched into a 15-minute presentation filled with technical-sounding gibberish. She talked about sediment buildup in the primary conduits and pressure fluctuations from the municipal source. She showed a blurry photo of a random pipe she'd likely found on the internet. It was a performance, and a bad one at that. Therefore, she concluded, her voice rising with manufactured gravity, the board proposes a one-time special assessment of $2,000 per household. This will allow us to hire the necessary contractors to perform a full system flush and replace the aging valves. It's a significant investment, but one we must make to protect our property values and our quality of life. A wave of groans and angry mutterings swept through the room. $2,000 was a huge blow for most of these families. A man in the back stood up. "Karen, the city water department says there are no reported issues on their end. I called them myself this morning." Karen's face tightened. "That's because the issue is on our side of the meter," she snapped, her composure cracking slightly. "It's our responsibility. Now, we need a motion to vote on the assessment." Bob, the meek board member, dutifully made the motion. Karen looked out at the crowd, a predatory gleam in her eye, ready to push her vote through the panicked crowd. "Is there any discussion before we vote?" she asked, a mere formality. This was my cue. I stood up slowly. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me. "Yes," I said, my voice calm and steady, carrying easily through the tense room. I have a few points of clarification. Karen's smile was pure acid. Mr. Coleman, I'm surprised to see you here. I would think you'd be busy trying to solve your own plumbing issues. This discussion is for members in good standing. I am a member in good standing, Karen, I replied, holding up the receipt for my last paid assessment. And my plumbing issues are, in fact, directly related to this discussion. As are yours. As are everyone's in this room. I placed my binder on the podium with a solid, definitive thud. I have a presentation of my own. It concerns the true source of our water, the reason for the shortage, and a permanent solution that won't cost anyone $2,000. Karen's face went from smug to confused to alarmed. This is not on the agenda. You are out of order. I believe the homeowners here deserve to know why their taps are running dry before you pick their pockets, I said, turning to address the room. Don't you? A chorus of yes, and let him speak, erupted from the audience. George and Marco Garcia were the loudest. The power dynamic in the room had just begun to shift. Karen, seeing her control slipping, had no choice but to relent, though her expression was thunderous. Fine, she hissed. You have 5 minutes. I'll only need 4, I said. I turned to the first page of my binder, cleared my throat, and began. Let's start with a brief history lesson. I began not with an accusation, but with a story. My voice was calm and measured, the voice of an engineer explaining a system. In 1946, my grandfather, a man named Thomas Coleman, purchased a 10-acre plot of land right here, where we are all sitting. For the next 50 years, our family farmed this land. One of the first things he did was drill a well. Not just any well, but a deep, powerful artesian well that tapped into the Edwards Aquifer. That well has provided clean, reliable water for over 70 years. I paused, letting the information sink in. I could see people exchanging confused glances. Karen was shifting on her feet, a knot of unease tightening her features. When the developer, Mr. Henderson, planned Oakwood Estates, I continued, he was faced with a choice. Spend a fortune connecting to the distant municipal water supply, or find another source. He found another source. My well. We made an agreement. He could use my water to supply his new neighborhood, and in exchange, his company would cover all the maintenance and electrical costs for the pump. A collective gasp went through the room. The murmuring grew louder. That agreement, I said, raising my voice slightly to be heard over the din, was inherited by the HOA when it took over. The quarterly payment your treasurer makes for utility easement maintenance isn't for a pipe running through my land. It's for the electricity and upkeep of the pump that provides every drop of water to every home in this subdivision. I turned a page in my binder and held it up for all to see. It was the certified county plat map, with my property outlined in red. I pointed to a small blue dot well inside the red lines. This is my property, and this is the well, and this is the pump house. They are not and have never been HOA or municipal property. They belong to me. The room exploded. People were on their feet, shouting questions, pointing fingers at Karen, who looked as if she'd been struck by lightning. Her face was a ghastly shade of pale, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. I held up my hand for silence. Which brings us to the current crisis. There is no blockage in the municipal feed. There is no aging infrastructure that needs a $20,000 repair. The truth is much simpler. I looked directly at Karen, my voice dropping to a cold, hard tone. Last week, in an act of petty retaliation over a landscaping dispute, your HOA president, Karen Miller, illegally entered my property and ordered a contractor to shut off the main water valve to my home. I let that statement hang in the air. The silence was absolute, heavy, and damning. What she didn't understand, I said, my voice ringing with clarity, is that in shutting off the valve to my house, she also shut off the main feed from the pump to the rest of the neighborhood. She is the blockage. She is the reason your lawns are dying and you can't take a shower. She manufactured this crisis through her own ignorance and malice, and then tried to charge you $2,000 each to fix it. Chaos erupted. The room was a cacophony of outrage. Thief! Someone screamed. Fraud! Yelled another. George Peterson was on his feet, his face red with anger. She fined me for wind chimes while she was cutting off our water. Marco Garcia was shouting at the 2 other board members. Did you know about this? Were you a part of this? They both shook their heads, looking terrified, trying to physically distance themselves from Karen. Karen herself was frozen, a statue of pure horror, as her entire world crumbled around her in a matter of seconds. Maria stood up beside me. "If I may," she said, her lawyerly voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. "My client, Mr. Coleman, is not here to punish the community. He is here to offer a solution." She held up a copy of the Water Utility Easement and Service Agreement. "Mr. Coleman is prepared to enter into a new, formal, legally binding agreement that will guarantee water access for this community in perpetuity. It establishes a transparent, homeowner-run water board to oversee costs and maintenance. It removes control of your most vital resource from the hands of the current HOA leadership, who have proven themselves dangerously incompetent. And most importantly, it will restore your water service within the hour of its signing." I distributed the copies of the agreement. People snatched them up, reading them with feverish intensity. The path forward was clear. They could either side with the woman who had deceived them and left them high and dry, or they could sign the document that would restore their water and their autonomy. The choice was obvious. The tide of public opinion had turned into a tsunami, and it was about to crash down directly on top of Karen Miller. She looked from the angry faces of her neighbors to the legal document in their hands, and in that moment, she knew she was utterly and completely finished. The aftermath of the revelation was swift and brutal. The community, now unified in their fury, turned on Karen with a vengeance. The motion to approve her special assessment was laughed out of the room. It was replaced by a motion, raised by George Peterson, to immediately remove Karen Miller as president of the HOA, citing gross negligence, fraudulent misrepresentation, and abuse of authority. The vote was unanimous, save for one abstention: Karen herself, who stood there trembling, unable to even raise her hand in her own defense. The other two board members, desperate to save their own skins, voted enthusiastically for her ouster. In the span of 30 minutes, she had gone from the neighborhood's supreme ruler to a disgraced outcast. The second motion, introduced by Marco Garcia, was to accept the terms of my water utility easement and service agreement. Again, a unanimous vote. The remaining board members, humbled and terrified of the potential lawsuits, signed the agreement on behalf of the HOA right there on the podium. Maria notarized the signatures, making it official. The cage was locked. The first act of the newly empowered community was to elect an interim water board, as stipulated in the agreement. George Peterson, Marco Garcia, and a sharp-witted retired nurse named Brenda were elected by a show of hands. Their first official act was to accompany me back to my property. As we walked across the dark lawns, a small crowd of neighbors followed, a procession of the newly liberated. They were quiet, watching with a kind of awe as I approached the main valve near my driveway. I took a large wrench from my toolbox, fitted it onto the T-handle, and with a few grunts of effort, turned it counterclockwise. A deep groaning sound came from the pipes, followed by a powerful hiss, and then the undeniable glorious sound of rushing water. A cheer went up from the small crowd. It was a sound of pure relief. Faucets were being turned on all over the neighborhood. Toilets were flushing. Life was returning to normal. I looked over at Karen's house. The lights were on, but the curtains were drawn. Her reign was over. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. Maria, on my behalf, filed a civil lawsuit against Karen personally. We weren't suing for a huge amount of money. The suit was for the cost of the emergency water I'd had to buy, the damage to my landscaping, and punitive damages for harassment and willful interference with a private utility. The point wasn't to bankrupt her. The point was to hold her accountable in a court of law. We also filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board against the contractor she had hired, who, it turned out, was not a licensed plumber. He quickly settled, providing a sworn affidavit detailing how Karen had hired him and specifically instructed him to shut off my water main, which became a key piece of evidence in our case against her. The new water board worked efficiently. They established a bank account, sent out notices with the new lower water fees, and hired a professional, licensed company to perform a full inspection and maintenance service on my well and pump system, all paid for from the new water fund. The sense of community, which had been a fiction under Karen's rule, began to actually form. People started talking to each other again, not in hushed whispers about the latest HOA violation, but in open conversation. There was a neighborhood barbecue, the first in years that wasn't an officially sanctioned, sterile HOA event. People brought covered dishes, kids ran through sprinklers, and for the first time it felt like a neighborhood. George brought over a bouquet of his prize-winning roses for me to place on my wife's grave. "Eleanor would have loved what you did, Jack," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You stood up. You made us all remember that we have a voice." Karen's downfall was as complete as it was spectacular. Faced with a mountain of legal fees and the open hostility of every neighbor, she put her house up for sale. The final symbolic confrontation came the day the moving truck was parked in her driveway. I was out in my garden, tending to the tomato plants that had survived the artificial drought. She walked across the street, her face pale and drawn. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow bitterness. "You destroyed me," she said, her voice a low rasp. "I didn't destroy you, Karen," I replied, not even looking up from my work. "I just handed you the shovel. You dug the hole all by yourself. You mistook rules for wisdom and authority for respect. You bullied good people because it made you feel powerful. But your power was built on a lie, and lies, like poorly built foundations, always crumble." She stood there for a long moment, as if expecting me to say more, to offer some kind of absolution. I offered none. I simply continued to tend my garden. Defeated, she turned and walked away for the last time. As I watched her go, I felt not triumph, but a quiet sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served. Order had been restored. The victory wasn't just in getting my water turned back on. It was in seeing a community shake off the yoke of a petty tyrant and learn to govern itself. It was in proving that a single, determined person, armed with the truth and a well-documented plan, could dismantle a corrupt system. The pump in the little brick house continued its steady, rhythmic chugging, a quiet heartbeat sending life-giving water through the neighborhood. My grandfather had built it to last, a legacy of self-sufficiency and strength, and I had honored that legacy. The water was flowing freely once again, not as a privilege granted by a queen, but as a right shared among neighbors.